Has D&D gone DEI crazy? Stay tuned to see why Wizards of the Coast is going race blind. Subscribe. Welcome, adventurers. Today we are diving into the magical world of Dungeons & Dragons, where the mighty Wizards of the Coast may have decided to go race blind. Yes, you heard that right. Join me as we discover and explore the direction of the new game that we all love. Is this just another case of D&D going DEI crazy? Or is this an ultimate step towards the truly inclusive world? And more importantly, will this mean that your orc can now finally open that vegan bistro he's always dreamed of? So are you ready to dive into what may be a woke mentality infecting all of D&D? Or maybe this is exactly the change that you've been looking for if you're jumping into the TTRPG scene, especially when it comes to Dungeons & Dragons. If you haven't known already, it's coming up to the 50-year anniversary of Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson's creation, which is Dungeons & Dragons. And supposedly, according to this article that we're going to be looking at together, that was developed based on Tolkien's work. So all of your Lord of the Rings series is what influenced Dungeons & Dragons, right? What the argument in the article is saying that because that was a colonial mentality back then and everything was based on race, it really doesn't serve a purpose in the fantasy world anymore. So let's see if we agree with that. So, once thought a pastime for nerds and basements, Dungeons & Dragons now reigns as a cultural powerhouse, the OG of tabletop role-playing. In its 50th anniversary, the storied fantasy role-playing game is now making a long overdue and noteworthy connection to its scientifically benighted treatment of race. And this is actually being handled by scientificamerican.com. And I didn't say who the writer of the article is. It is Stephen Deschal. I'm assuming that's how you pronounce it. Don't want to be offensive if I'm pronouncing it incorrectly. In this article, it goes on to mention back in the 1980s, there was a lot of religious organizations that came after Dungeons & Dragons because it specifically mentioned things that were of the magical nature. We also saw this happen whenever Harry Potter came out. People kind of went crazy and claimed that it was satanic and stuff. And in my opinion, that's crazy because as a Christian, I believe in discernment and being able to tell what's real and what's not real, and being able to have a strong enough biblical foundation that I'm not shook by things like this. That's my personal view. I know not everybody's view is going to be the same, and maybe that's a little bit controversial, but that's my approach here. But Wizards of the Coast back then was considered satanic, and then as it's progressed and moved on, it's kind of moved away from that over time and stuff. But usually you're just hanging out with a bunch of your homeboys and homegirls around the table, and you're rolling some dice and eating some pizza and snacks and just having a good old time for anywhere between 2 to 8 hours. So they say in this article that Wizards of the Coast will release a player's handbook that changes the terminology of the characters' physiological types, take all the previously referred points that were known as races, and now they'll be replaced with species. So you'll no longer say what race you are on your character sheet, you will say what species you are. Which, scientifically speaking, is more accurate because elves and humans are not the same, and race actually describes like skin colors and tones of humans, where they will be getting rid of that, I guess, to describe each species. But here's the thing that's kind of weird about it, and I haven't dove into this, and I don't think it mentions it in an article either, but you have different races of species. You have different races of elves. So I wonder if they're going to remove it all the way around. It didn't mention it in the article, but we'll see. Announced in 2022, the company's action was motivated by a view that species is a term that didn't require explanation and that highlighted the fantastical nature of the game's non-human options. So that's kind of the way of saying everything was non-human, right? They go on to say that Wizards of the Coast has been removed both the company's stated reasons and scientifically as a correction for the long-running error of describing species as races. Kids playing a fun game will no longer pick up a botched genetical notion of race along their 20-sided dice. I don't know a bunch of kids that are playing D&D. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm not in with the times. But I haven't heard about it in any of the social circles that my kids are in, and they fall into that preteen right now. And I haven't heard any of their friends playing. So they said, however, others felt insulted, arguing that Wizards of the Coast was given into the woke mentality, fearful of invoking the word race. Still, others appreciated the move but didn't feel like it went far enough. They recommended the removal of the material that could be deemed offensive. This last group is highly critical of the biological essentialism, parroting that the scientific and evolutionary languages to explain marked social and cultural differences between the groups that come with the use of terms like race to distinguish between humans and other like elves, dwarves, and orcs, particularly because of stereotyped real-world associations made at times to these fantasy species. Basically, because fantasy world sometimes mirrors our own real world, they didn't like the idea that the races had negative connotations still. That's really what it comes down to. He goes on to say, as a social scientist who studies male-dominated subcultures, I have done research that puts me in spaces where I've delved into the reactions to issues of race in gaming. A key question is this: given how charged the term race has been, why would games use it to discuss differences that have nothing to do with the way we traditionally use the word? That's a fair question there. Dungeons & Dragons is not only a game that uses the term in this way, many other digital and analog fantasy offerings. And then it goes on to what we discussed earlier about how Gary Gygax and all them made this in 1973, and it was during colonial racism, and Tolkien used the words race and species kind of interchangeably. That's why Gary Gygax decided to do that and bring that into Dungeons & Dragons. Biological essentialism is seen deep in this game. In the earliest versions, the authors distinguished between humans and other groups collectively called demi-humans. Notably, players who chose the dwarves, elves, halflings, or other demi-humans had limits that humans did not have. They were lesser beings. They could only have certain professions in the game, they could only progress so far, and had built-in limitations. Further, all demi-humans had some form of seeing in the dark, which marked them between something of human and animal. So they had pluses, but they also had their minuses, and it was all based on race in the early D&D. The most cited element of biological determinism in the early game, however, was a table created in the first edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons game that dictated that demi-human cultures would get along easily or have a natural dislike. Elves and dwarves had empathy by fiat. Neither liked half-orcs, and gnomes for some reason only tolerated half-elves. So the spicy part of the game, right? The spiciness between the different races, because we know like you don't trust half-orcs usually when they come into establishments and stuff like that. It made this uneasiness there. Or I'm sorry, not humans, elves. I didn't trust half-orcs. It made this uneasiness, which in my games we have experienced, and I feel like it adds a layer of depth to the game. I think if you're removing it, it kind of takes that away. Everybody isn't singing Kumbaya in any of the games that we've ever played. So this is often discussed in the same breath of evil races, as different species were assigned as an overall cultural moral stance, with some, such as orcs, deemed inherently evil. Particularly since the influx of new fans to the 4th edition of Dungeons & Dragons, these ideas were roundly criticized by scholars and others, reinforcing the sense of nature, not nurture, in terms of racism, discrimination, and morality, echoing that human genetics origins in white supremacy, marking some groups as inherently bad. Because they were white guys, they kind of have this inherent racism that's in there. I don't know if any of that's true. I think you're just trying to make a fun game, and having some discourse between the different species definitely make it more realistic as far as how it would portray to our world. Throughout the years, different editions of Dungeons & Dragons have reconsidered some of the components of essentialism. Level limitations for different racial groups were removed, with gaming stat limitations on non-human species provided different systems to explain their advantages and disadvantages. Wizards of the Coast has reworked the game system of morality, called alignment in recent editions, and eliminated the concept of evil races. The 5th edition and 2024 modification reintroduces species like orcs and dark elves in a manner that pushes back on their historical characterizations of evil cultures and inherently bad species. Here's my view of it, right? We all want to play a game that kind of from the fantasy world, but we still want that adventure. We still want some struggle. We still want things that we have to overcome, right? And I think that if you make a bunch of these changes, and I'm not saying like word from race to species, it actually scientifically makes more sense to do so. I don't think you eliminate race altogether because, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, you have different races of those species. So I think race still needs to be there, but I don't think you have to dive into it and say, oh, well, all of these species work together in harmony. No, that's not the case at all. As a matter of fact, in real life, it's not even kind of close. And I know we're playing the game to escape real life, but we still have to be grounded in somewhere. We use a lot of real life to describe why certain things wouldn't work in Dungeons and Dragons, like why water would freeze in Dungeons and Dragons. If you use the spell create water and it's an icy condition, you would use our real world to describe why that effect happens. It doesn't make any sense to me, but that's my personal opinion. I'm interested in what your personal opinion is. I appreciate you taking the time to look at this video. 98% of the viewers on my videos still are not subscribed, so if you don't care, hit that subscribe button. Make sure to leave a comment on your position below. I'm so excited to see it. Make sure to keep it civil though, guys, and also make sure to like the video. I look forward to seeing you in future videos. Remember, it's okay to be awesome. You are awesome. Go show the world you're awesome. Catch you on the next one.